Executive Director of the Jay Heritage Center, and welcome to our 2022 Sustainability Summit. No applause necessary, but so for those of you, I see some faces who have been here before and some who haven't been before. If you haven't been here before, this is the boyhood home, this estate, the boyhood home of John Jay, the founding father. And this is our 30th anniversary this year. And we're now an education center. We do programs in history, social justice, environmental stewardship, and a lot of other things. And we also, if you haven't visited yet, we just installed a gardens, which is on the other side of the property, 3 beautiful garden rooms designed by Thomas Waltz from Nelson Bird Waltz. And they just opened this year, had their grand opening. And they're open every Sunday from 10 to 5 in the season, and every Thursday from 10 to 2. You don't need a reservation. You can just come by and check them out. And they're really magnificent. And this weekend, this Sunday is actually the last Sunday of the season. So if you're in town and you want to check them out before we close for the season, please do come by. So we're really lucky to have some amazing speakers today. We're going to hear first from Larry Weaner. He's going to talk for about an hour from Larry Weaner Landscape Associates. You know him. And then at 2, we're going to hear from Doug Tallamy, who's going to talk about his most recent book, The Nature of Oaks. And then at 3 o'clock, we're going to have some breakout sessions. We have Frank Buccello here from New York State. He's the horticulture inspector for New York State Parks. And he's going to lead a breakout session about spotted lanternfly and how we have a trap over by the gardens, and we're going to talk about he's going to talk about spotted lanternfly in general, how we're monitoring it here. And our own Liz Garrett will be right here in this room talking about healthy yards. She's on the board of our board of trustees, and she's a landscape designer at Renee Byers. So we've got a great and full day of programs today. I want to thank Sarah Goddard, who's somewhere here on our program committee. She's in the front, who helped organize this today, and our whole program committee. And on behalf of Suzanne Clary and our president of the board and our entire board, I want to welcome you to our Sustainability Day. We're going to start off with Larry Weaner, who you know. He's Larry, in addition to all the work that he's done. Also designed our meadow here in 2006, and so he's been an important part of the reclamation of this landscape for a long time. So without further ado, please welcome Larry Weaner.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for all you do. And Suzanne, there's been, every time I show up here, and it's not that long a time in between, there seems to be something new, either accomplished or in process. So it's really great to see an organization that's so active in pursuing their mission. Maybe active is an understatement when it comes to Suzanne. She is really a dynamo in terms of getting her foot in the door and getting into the room and making something happen. So I appreciate all the folks that do the work they do here. So I'm going to talk about my house exclusively today, which you may say, why the heck would I want to sit and listen to a whole lecture on your little halfway between a quarter and a third of an acre property in the inner ring suburbs of Philadelphia? Wouldn't I rather see a whole slew of places and all the different things? Yeah, I could do that and do that often, but I've lived there for 34 years. I've seen one landscape over 34 years. I've actually never even designed the landscape. I was always going to do a formal plan next week, and somehow next week never came, and at this point I wouldn't bother. Because the design has been a series of interactions between me and that landscape for 34 years. So let's kind of take a look at what that's about. This isn't my house now. This is the house I grew up in Northeast Philadelphia. They're twins, meaning there are 2 little tiny houses connected, and one has then a little alley between the next 2 houses, and the front yard and the backyard were both postage stamps, basically. You've kind of seen my property, if you've ever taken a train from the suburbs into the center city, almost anywhere, and you go through neighborhoods and you see these little backyards, that's my house. My last year of high school, I graduated high school. Growing up, I had no idea there was such a thing as garden design, landscape design. I don't think I might not have even known what horticulture was, to be honest with you. In my neighborhood, if you wanted to plant a tree, you went to Kmart in the back where they have a few trees, and you planted, bought a tree and planted it. Either mowed your own lawn or paid a 12-year-old kid to do it. So I wasn't really aware of this, but as a summer job, after graduating high school, I got a job with a landscape contractor. I did love wandering out around the woods. You say you lived in Philadelphia, what woods? A little fragment that is now that is now part of a hospital, but then was a little fragment of, I'm sure, invasive clogged woodland. But to me, it was like 3 blocks away in the wildlands. So that's where my interest really started in this whole landscape thing. So I got a job just digging holes on a crew with a landscape contractor, very small operation, him and me and one other person. But he was a very interesting, creative guy, got me interested in it, and I went home and I planted this landscape in the little postage stamp front yard, not predominantly native plants. Nobody was even talking about native versus that wasn't even in the conversation back then. Graduated in 1971, so this would have been around that time. So I plant this landscape, and you can see the columbine growing nicely and flowering. Well, I didn't plant any of that there. I planted it all the way in the back right corner where you can kind of see some hosta, this low blue hosta. That's where I planted it. And it became extirpated pretty quickly, but it popped up where you see it, which is actually the gravel path that goes through the garden. It's just pea gravel. That's it. There's no soil. Eventually there is, but for quite a ways, it's just pea gravel. And the columbine died where the hosta was and literally colonized the entire path. So what did I learn from that? I learned nothing. Because I didn't ask the question below, what's going on here? Like, why did this happen? All I did was, oh, I like that. And my mother said, I can't walk the path anymore, get rid of it. And that was what it was. And I grew up in Philadelphia, as I said. I also did not, a lot of people when I talk to, they're, horticulturists, plant lovers, landscape designers, talk about their parents taking them in the woods and doing gardening, or their grandmother's vegetable garden. My parents had no interest in plants, wildness. The only thing my father ever said to me when I planted something was, that thing's not going to get too big, is it? And so, I don't even know why the heck I'm in this field, to be honest with you, but I am. So at any rate, he's a great, great man, but not interested in plants and landscape. So I didn't learn anything because I didn't ask why. I didn't try to figure it out. What's going on here? And, that's where the hosta was, right behind that patch of dianthus, bath's pink. I will say, the very beginning, I didn't know from native plants, non-native plants, exotic. But I think one idea in my head was that what I was doing, if it required an intense amount of care to keep this thing going, that kind of got on my nerves. Maybe it's just because I'm lazy, or maybe it's just because I admire things that are self-sufficient or more self-sufficient. So whenever it was like, I started learning a lot about plants, but I was very selfish about them. I'm not like a individual plant lover. I'm not a plant nerd. I'm a place nerd. I love places. And so I'm selfish looking at plants, even before I was thinking about ecology and native plants and insects and all that stuff. I still looked at them selfishly. What can you do for me? What are you going to do in this landscape on your own that's going to make it easier and still be a place of interest and beauty? So, that's kind of what I was looking for. And dianthus bass pink was a really good one. In fact, most of those low dianthuses, they do the fairy ring thing, which is after a while they end up with foliage around the outer edge and like a zone in the middle where there's nothing. And the dianthus bass pink didn't do that. It had nice gray foliage all year. It formed a nice cover. It did that pink flower thing in the spring. So it didn't require, cut it back, do this, do that. Okay, you're on my good person list here. So that's just the aerial of where I live. The front yard is kind of upper left, and the backyard, which is a little bigger, is in the rear, and it's about between a quarter and a third of an acre. And here it was in the early days in my backyard. There's a flat terrace. I did, not on paper, design a terrace with some vegetated areas within it, and that's pretty much it as far as, pre-planned laying things out. But what you're seeing here is the early stages. And it's interesting because you can see that pink phlox pilosa. I planted that. You can see that little dwarfy rose that was there. What was on that bank, let me say, to start with, was just solid English ivy, which I just grubbed out and planted some things. But I didn't come in here, like I said, I never designed it. I picked up some plants here and there, in the course of my work, and put some things in. And, I understand where things grow better and not. So it wasn't just, throw it over my shoulder and where it landed, but there was not a plan. So what you're looking at, phlox pilosa, I planted that. That little dwarf rose was actually the only other plant other than English ivy that was on that slope. I don't know what kind of rose it is. It's a shrub rose of a short stature, and it blooms on and off all year. And because it's a non-native plant, I'm not going to get rid of it, and it's still there. It's a very beautiful thing, but it fell in the category of, okay, a tough thing that can live on its own. It was living with ivy. That's not easy to do. And then what's the white flower? That's daisy fleabane. It came in on its own. And why did it come in on its own? Because when I grubbed out the ivy, I created a disturbance and opened up the soil to sunlight, removed the competition, created kind of a seed bed. And so dormant seeds that were still viable but suppressed by the ivy grew. And one of the things that grew was daisy fleabane. Now, I didn't understand this way back 34 years ago as well as I do now, but daisy fleabane is called, a lot of names for this kind of plant, but a ruderal species, a plant that comes in after disturbance, grows quick, flowers, disperses seeds quickly, and then dies. It's a biennial, and its goal is to get seed out there because it's only got a short lifespan. There's no point in growing a deep root system. You're a biennial, or if you're same thing if you're an annual, even shorter. So that plant was there as a response to my grubbing out the ivy. Now you can look at that daisy fleabane and say, well, it's a pretty white flower. I like it. Or you can look at that daisy fleabane and say, it's kind of a ratty looking thing, and I don't like it. So what should you do going forward? It doesn't matter what you do, because that plant is a short-lived ruderal species, and whether you plant other longer-lived perennials that are more competitive, they will compete that plant out. Or if you don't plant more competitive species, nature will throw something in there, maybe something you like, probably something you don't, and that will compete that plant out. So do I like it? Do I not like it? Should I keep it? Should I not keep it? It doesn't matter. It's gone soon. So this is kind of looking at a landscape and reading it. Where's it headed? What's going on here again? So here's my backyard, and this is a number of years after, later than that early kind of milieu of ruderal species, a few things I planted, a leftover from the old garden. So now you got Pachyra aureus as one of the main matrix. Looks like it's the whole thing, but it's just because it's early spring, and that's the first plant to come up. A little bit of native azalea and some trees. That's the backyard. There it is if you look away from the house. It looks a lot bigger than it is because of all the structure and dynamism of tall things forward. The dullest thing you can do, and I'm not saying this can't be done beautifully because it has been many times, but just from a structural standpoint is tall, medium, short. It's so defined. It just gives you that arrangement, there's no mystery. There's nothing behind anything that you can't see. It's just one palette in front of you. As soon as there's height coming forward, height backwards, different levels, now all of a sudden there's spaces, there's dynamism. I see through there, I don't see through there. And things look much bigger. It's counterintuitive. You think, well, if I kind of separate things and have a lot of taller things in there, it's going to box me in. It's going to make it. It depends on what those taller things are. If you surround yourself with a dense shrub that you can't see through, yeah, you've boxed yourself in. If you put a few of those same dense shrubs scattered around, now they've blocked certain views, but there's places in between. And in the in between, maybe there are some things that are light and airy textured that you kind of see through. And then there's places where you have a full-fledged window and you see through everything. That is all manipulatable in terms of how you're experiencing a place, but it is also within the context of how things grow in nature. Nature doesn't go, okay, you're tall, you go in the back, you're in the middle, it doesn't work that way. So I want to look at two plants. Well, here's columbine again. Same columbine like at my house, but now it's many years later. And now I've observed how columbine acts in the wild and am now intentionally using it with the understanding that it is not competitive, but it will seed itself around, find dry places where it likes to grow and will seed into those, not where there's dense vegetative competition. So let's kind of look at another plant that was on my slope in the early days. So that's the early days of planting, not as early as that first picture with the rose. Things are starting to come together, but it's still not dense and filled in, meaning the columbine can still survive because it has not yet got competed out. It's not a very competitive plant. Cardinal flower was also planted on that slope. Two opposite environments that they would grow in. If you kind of look, you can see there's a little bit of a stream that I built through that vegetation, and that's where the cardinal flower was. Both of those plants at different locations were on that slope in the early years. Here's a picture of it a number of years later. There's no more cardinal flower, there's no more columbine. Was this a failed planting of those two plants? You could say it was, they were planted and they're not there anymore, but that's what they are. They are non-competitive, short-lived species in two different environments, but operating similarly in that they are not very competitive. Their way to proliferate as a species is to get seed out quick before they get out-competed. So what we've got now is a dense cover on that bank, and we don't have any more cardinal flower and we don't have any more columbine. These plants have been extirpated due to their lack of competitive abilities and the extreme strong competitive abilities of the packer and other things that are in there. However, you can see kind of at the bottom there's a stone terrace. So you just catch a little bit of it under that bench. That's where the columbine shows up. Kind of like, but now I understand it. I understand this plant. It's not like when I was at my parents' house and it was just, oh, okay. No, I understand what's going on here because I've since seen this plant growing out of cracks of a rock, cement in a bridge abutment. And you could look at a plant like that and say, oh, wow, it can grow in the crack of a cement bridge abutment. That's a really competitive plant. No, it's the opposite. That plant has evolved to grow where other plants can't grow to get away from the competition. Interesting. So here I got it growing out of the cracks of my terrace. I didn't plant it there. I planted it much earlier on the slope where it got extirpated. Why is it growing here? That's the base of an American hornbeam tree. Hornbeam is in the beech family, and the beech family is very shallow, dense roots. If you go into a beech woods, you find that it's very depauperate on the ground layer. Yeah, deer eat everything. I don't understand that. But deer outside of deer predation, a beech woods tends to be very depauperate because the root system is dense and just takes the water nutrient out of the soil, and the canopy is very dense also. So why do columbines show up there? Because it's so dry at the base of that tree that you don't get a solid vegetative cover. There's little gaps, meaning that when columbine seed falls in the dense packera, it can't germinate. It's too, there's no sunlight, there's no opening. But when a seed gets underneath the hornbeam tree, there's little openings. So if a seed hits one of those openings, it can grow. And, there it is coming in there. This is the end of my asphalt driveway at the front of the house. And that columbine, its feet is in the gravel base of the driveway. Gravel, remember? Gravel. So now, when I'm planting columbine at my yard, early days, or on a project, you could say, well, how many columbine do I need to make a show? Well, I'm not going to waste money on columbine that is going to only last for a few years because I'm always planting a dense ground layer. If I don't do that, I'm going to have more weeds. So that's always a goal, is to have a dense ground cover to suppress weeds. And the bigger the scale, the more aggressive they need to be. But there's always a solid cover as one of the major goals. But a plant like columbine is not going to persist over time with that solid cover. So why do I plant it at all? I'm not going to plant gazillions of them because it's a waste of money. I'm only going to have it for a short period of time. I plant a few. Why? A little columbine there and one over there. It's not really much of a show in the landscape. I'm planting them as a seed source. They are basically distributing seeds throughout the landscape and finding places where other plants can't grow. In the edge of the gravel driveway, underneath the beach, where maybe the hornbeam, where maybe there's some things growing, but they're not as dense. So the idea here is I'm planting the plant as a source of seed. And I don't want to plant 10 of them over here. If I'm going to plant 10, because the seed is not going to travel around the property as well, if I'm going to plant 10 of them, I'm going to plant, 3 and 3 and 3 so that they have seeds that will be more efficiently spread around the landscape. Micro habitats, finding these little drier, wetter areas, that's part of garden design and understanding which plants will go best where. But there's a certain point where we can't identify every single little 3-inch change in the landscape. So by putting some plants that maybe like it wetter than the normal condition on your property, or drier, is basically getting seeds around that can kind of tolerate almost anything. Wherever there's an opening, there's a plant that can tolerate the condition of that opening, because there's plants, your basic soil hydrology is here, but you got some a little beyond and some a little beyond. All right, so for years, the cardinal flower was extirpated from my property. Off the top of my head, 7, 8 years, I didn't see a plant. Then all of a sudden, at the base of the stream, one little scraggly cardinal flower showed up. So I'd forgotten about him, honestly. I wasn't like lamenting the loss of the cardinal flower. This is the way nature does it. So I thought, oh yeah, let's see if we can get it going again. So I took a seed stalk, and down at the bottom, in this one of the little planted areas within the stone terrace, I found a little open gap in that native sedum ternatum. You see maidenhair fern on the top. And so I just put the stalk there and roughed up the soil to create a little seed bed. And I got a cardinal flower coming there, which isn't surprising. It germinates well from seed. But the next year, I started getting two plants in there. You see those seedlings. Euchera villosa, we'll talk about that later. And the longer, lighter green one is cardinal flower. So now I got all these seedlings of cardinal flower coming in the cracks of my stone terrace. And then the next year, I got cardinal flower in there. And then the next year, now my job is, my wife and I would like to use our terrace on occasion. We would like to have a path to walk up the steps to the upper part of the yard, as well as other things. So now my job is to remove cardinal flower. And now my job is to, oddly enough, I'm not planting anything, I'm killing stuff. I'm killing it, though, as a designer, because where I remove, this is kind of like an etching in wood. It's not what you put on, it's what you removed. So the design is now where I remove the liatris. And that is much of my design now, because I get a plant here and there, I put it in. Mostly, it's just natural recruitment and me determining yes, yes, no, yes, no. That's design. And part of it is the ecology. Obviously, there are weedy plants I don't want. They're an automatic no. There are plants that are native plants. You could say, well, you do want them. They're native. Not necessarily. A Joe Pye weed grows right in front of the window that looks out on my whole yard, and it gets 8 feet tall. I'm not going to leave it there. I might cut it back and keep it shorter, but I'm not going to just say, oh, I guess I can't see my yard anymore because I got a native plant, And here we go, where we had a couple years of cardinal flower running all over, and then decide, you know what, it's not as exciting as it was in the beginning. Let's have a place for our table again. And so you can see what's going on. But here's the story with cardinal flower. Why the heck? You see the slope a little bit on the right. You can see a little bit of it. That's where the cardinal flower was originally. Obviously, when it rains, water comes off that slope onto the terrace. How come for years there was no cardinal flower in that terrace? There was no cardinal flower anywhere on the property once it got extirpated on the bank, until I put that, except for that one plant, until I put a seed stalk in the bed down below. And then all of a sudden this happened. I didn't understand, nor could I figure it out. But in discussions with ecologists, a botanist actually, I learned that cardinal flower seeds, which are very tiny, actually attach themselves to soil particles. Probably it's a floodplain species. Probably it's an evolved strategy to stay in place when floodwaters come through. At any rate, so the seeds that were on that bank were not being carried down because they were attached to soil. And my planting on the ground layer is so dense that there's not soil coming down. If soil came down, it would take the seed with it. But there isn't because it's so densely planted. So I never got cardinal flower until I put that stalk next to the stone terrace. Now the seeds fell on the stone. Nothing to attach themselves to, and they just wash with water into the cracks, and I got cardinal flower in virtually every crack in the stone terrace afterwards. And have had it ever since, and my decision is, okay, this year where we're going to leave the cardinal flower. Now, there's something in this picture that you could look at to call me a liar about the fact that cardinal flower won't move when it's attached to soil. If you look at the very back, there's a steep slope, and it's all covered with cardinal flower. There's no way because the cardinal flower only comes up either within the terrace or on the immediate edges of the terrace, because as soon as it hits soil, it attaches the soil and it doesn't keep going. It can only travel where the stone will take it. And it isn't going to take it up that hill, that soil. So I take seed and put it up there, basically assisted proliferation, which is a key element of this kind of design, is understanding the proliferation of plants, putting them in a position to succeed from a proliferation standpoint, and in some cases assisting the proliferation. In this case, just moving seeds around where they wouldn't go on their own. This is interesting. Those towers were actually, first of all, that's the only sunny part of my property. I'm basically living in a woodland. That little corner is sunny, and that was the vegetable garden. And I planted corn. I wanted to do the Three Sisters Native American arrangement that you all have heard of, I'm sure. Corn, beans, and squash. And you plant the corn, and the beans grows up the corn stalk, and the squash is crawling around covering the ground. So I planted that composition. And the corn stalks grew, and the beans grew up, and the beans pulled the corn stalks down to the ground. Now, what I realized then is the corn that Native Americans were growing in this combination is not the same corn that's been hybridized to have huge kernels and be tall with lots of leaf axils and lots of fruit that, there was no doubt shorter and stockier and able to support beans. So that didn't work. So my next idea is to look for some heirloom corn varieties that go way, way back, which I'm planning on doing next week. I haven't kind of gotten around to that yet. But the pandemic hit, and I did not plant my vegetable garden. Picture was taken this past year. Neither of these 2 years did I plant vegetables. It's not enough sun. It's not full sun. I should just give it up, and I probably will. But anyway, no vegetables got planted. But what came up, because it's right on the edge of the terrace, is cardinal flower and Joe Pye weed, which I planted elsewhere on the property and is wind dispersed. So I don't have to do much to move that around. It's dispersing all over the property, and it does come up frequently on my property without any assistance and without any logical reason why it's here or not there. It's blowing around in the wind. So that's what naturally occurred, basically. Now we're talking 34 years after I moved in here. When I moved in, the seed bank in the soil was as in most places in suburban and urban, and in some cases farther out than suburban, the soil seed bank is dominated by plants we would consider weeds. So if I don't plant my vegetable garden, meaning there's bare soil and no competition to suppress weeds, if I would have abandoned that garden 34 years ago, it would have turned into a weed patch. But for 34 years, no undesirable plants have been allowed to go to seed, and native plants, including cardinal flower and Joe Pye weed, have been producing and dispersing seeds, in some cases with my help, but in this case, the cardinal flower didn't need my help because it was on the edge of the terrace. And so the soil seed bank is now completely different. It's the only plants depositing seeds, other than some things that maybe come in from elsewhere, within the property are desirable things because I either planted them or I allowed them to grow. So the whole dynamic of self-sufficiency, if you're looking to have a landscape that is dominated by native plants or just the plants that you are defining as desirable, has changed. You know, when a disturbance occurs in the suppressive vegetation from a seed germination standpoint, 34 years ago, it probably would have been a weed, and now it's a native plant. So not only is the ground layer suppressing weeds, keeping this landscape manageable, but over time, the seed bank has changed. And that's what happened. I didn't plant any of that. I didn't even think of it. That's what came in. A few weedy plants were mixed in. I pulled them out and then let these folks take over. Here's another spot. There's a bench, and here's the cardinal flower, part of that whole story. This is an old wrought iron bench that a client didn't want, and they were going to throw it away. And so I said it was a nice old, high quality made one. So I took it home, and I was going to restore it at some point next week, and I never did. But what happened was it started growing an incredible crop of moss and lichens, and the thing became an incredible sculpture. In fact, I could never design anything as intricate as that. So now, the problem with the bench is that wood is so deteriorated, if I go like this, it's going to collapse. So I can't let anybody sit on it. And I got it. You see the two pots on either side? They're holding it up, literally. If I took one of those pots away, the thing would just go like this. So it's on its last legs. I'm trying to keep it going as long as and every year it just gets more amazing, those lichens and mosses. Now, I can't let anybody sit on it, but this is my backyard. I want it to be nice. I'm not going to put a do not sit sign, in front of it if I have guests. So I decided I want to have a little garden, and I sometimes put a little pot in that space back there. I'll have a little vegetation that kind of makes it clear that, you don't go in there and sit on that bench. So what should I plant? I'm going to plant what decides to come in and edit it once it does. So you can see paccaris in there, there's Pennsylvania sedge, there's cardinal flower, there's geranium, and you can see the geranium off to the right. You can see that there. You can see the paccara with the rounder leaves. The grassy stuff is Pennsylvania sedge. On the left, you can see cardinal flower. I didn't plant any of it. All I did was I weed whip the cracks on the terrace just to keep it low, and it favors moss. There's a lot of moss, but you just weed whip it right to the moss where, we're walking around and where the table and chairs are. And if I don't do it, native stuff starts coming in. So all I had to do was not do it. And a couple things show up in the beginning, I extirpate them, so we leave it to the plants that I've allowed to stay. And, the cardinal flower, which, is all over every year in the backyard, you can basically, I'm traveling, I work a lot, my wife spends a lot of time in the backyard. There's two hummingbirds, one or two hummingbirds there all the time. From June, from early July till early September, because cardinal flower actually blooms. It's a stalk, and it blooms from the bottom and works its way up. If all the flowers open at the same time, it would only last for a few weeks, like most perennials. But because it works its way up, each flower has that. By the end, it's been quite a span. So really, it blooms for a long time, and the hummingbirds are there like all the time. And then one cardinal flower showed. That's actually a cardinal flower. That's a mutation that showed up coming out of the crack of the terrace there, between the wall and the terrace. And, it's the new type, and there's a nursery that's propagating from it. And see if it works. Assisting self-proliferation and spontaneous recruitment, which is kind of the heart of what I'm talking about here. In a traditional garden, you make a plant, you take that plan and arrange it, take all the plants and plant them according to that plan, and basically weed everything in between. This is very different than that. So one of the things that I'm considering in plant selection, we always talk about plant diversity. Doug Tallamy will follow me and talk brilliantly about the connections there. But we rarely talk about diversity of proliferation strategies. And if we are relying on proliferation to supplement what we have planted, we want all of the possible strategies to be present. And in this case, we've got two of the basic strategies, which would be seed dispersal, the geranium, and clonal root expansion or rhizomatous root expansion, which is the packer or the yellow flower. Some plants are dispersed by wind, like Joe Pyeweed. You plant a few, the wind will take them around. Other plants, like geranium, are dispersed just by gravity. They fall at the base of the plant, meaning you've got to scatter them around if you want to have them colonize throughout a property. And one thing to understand about woodland herbs, unlike meadow herbs, and I'm living in mainly a woodland property under trees. Woodland herbs, unlike meadow herbs, the seeds have a very short viability in most cases. That means if you buy seed from a seed house, by the time it's been collected, stored, shipped, and you get it in the ground, those seeds are not likely viable anymore. So the way to seed, and so that means, okay, you got to buy live plants. Well, maybe I can't afford to buy enough live plants to fill up my whole woodland. So the way to do it is to buy plants, again, in a little bit of a different wrinkle, but similar to planting columbines for their seed source, not just for the plants I planted. So we're planting geraniums for their seed source because unlike buying seed where you get it a long time after it became ripe, the seeds hit the ground exactly at the right time. And if you're able to identify the seeds are ripe, you can move them around just at the right time. So the effectiveness of seeding that landscape becomes the plants are seeding the landscape instead of you buying seed. And that's the way it is in the woods. Meadow, you can plant seed, whole thing from seed, the seed will be viable. So a lot of these strategies I'm talking about are because I'm in a woodland and I got to deal with the idea that I can't seed the landscape. Here's another strategy, and this would be birds. Many birds obviously eat berries. There's something very unfair potentially going on here because, I would like the aronia to proliferate on my property, and the birds come and they eat the berries and they go defecate them on somebody else's property. The world is not fair, is it? I saw everybody get sad when I said that. So if I want that plant to proliferate, what's one approach I can take? Do everything I can to keep those birds on my property for as long as possible so that the chances of those seeds being deposited elsewhere on the property are higher. So what am I going to do? Well, if the bird is going to eat aronia berries and then leave because there's nothing else there, well, not so good. But if I have all kinds of things there for the bird, like my little stream, and there's a scarlet tanager on that stream, and various layers, and Doug will talk with much more authority on this than I ever could. But if I have as much as possible there for the birds, they're hanging around. They're not just eating some berries and going somewhere else. And they're becoming part of the system. And we get to see them much more, my wife and I. And there's an indigo bunting on the stream, and there's a hawk up above the stream. My wife watched this happen and told me the story at the end of the day. I didn't see it, but there were a number of birds on the stream, and they like being in the stream riffle more than the deep pond, a lot of them. The doves and some of the other ones are down below, but most of those little birds are up on the top where the water's shallow and there's little pools and it's running. That's where they're drinking and bathing. So there's a bunch of birds on the stream. My wife's sitting on the window seat in the dining room watching because there's more if she's inside looking out than if she's out there. And All of a sudden, the hawk dive bombs this to the stream. And the birds, one thing I did not show, and I'll show it on the next one. He dive bombs that stream. You see the Leucothaway that's planted along that stream? It's very thicket forming, close stems. So the hawk dive bombs to the stream, the birds flee into the Leucothaway, and the hawk's sitting there kind of looking in and can't fit and goes away. Now, this is really interesting because it's about the subject matter I'm talking about, but it's also about kind of a process of learning over the time and really ingraining that learning so that it's kind of in you. And for years, I've observed the pattern of shrubs, thicket-forming shrubs, and how they extend out of the woods. You have the open field, and it's a farm field, and it's abandoned, and so shrubs are going to come in. Often they come in as peninsulas from the edge of the woods, like a clonal shrub, a gray dogwood or a sumac or tree like sassafras has clonal expanding root system. So if a seed happens to get established on the edge of the woods and that field is no longer being hayed or grazed or mowed, then it expands out into the field in a peninsular fashion. And then there doesn't happen to be any clonal shrubs, and then there's one over here, and it extends out into the field in a peninsular fashion. And so what you've got is this pattern of shrubs coming off the woods that's wavy. Well, I observed that. And as a landscape designer who is taking cues from nature, I understand why it happens. And so I've recreated that or managed for it. Now, then later on, I learned that there are certain birds that want to be, I hesitate to even talk about birds when I'm speaking before Doug Tallamy, but Doug, feel free to correct anything, trash me if you need to, believe me. I respect you enough that I'll take it. So at any rate, there are birds that want to be in those herbaceous interspaces between the shrubs. So, okay, now I know one reason why I should do that. First, it says, I observe that's the pattern. Okay, must make sense. Then I say, oh, it's good for wildlife. Okay, that's good. Do I know why birds want to be there? No. Now I do, when my wife told me this story, because it's very similar. The birds were in the water and they needed shrubs to flee into, and that's where the birds want to be in those interim. So, now I got that baked in my head. That whole scenario about the birds, the vegetative patterns, why that pattern occurs, why birds like it. And the more you understand, the more you can recreate something that has real ecological functions. And when I first did it, way back when I observed, oh yeah, that's a pattern. I got this old horrible photo of that I took because of that. And I did that just because in the early days when I wasn't thinking as much about ecological process and plant interactions, it was just a beautiful pattern that I observed that I wanted to recreate. Then I learned a little bit about ornithology, and I realized, oh, there's ecological value to that. Then my wife tells me a story, and it's like, oh, now I know why the birds want to be there. So now I can recreate that situation, not just accidentally by mimicking what nature does, but I could recreate it in many different. Look, the stream with the thicket is not the same as a meadow with. It's maybe the same concept in terms of how the birds, both the hawk and the other smaller birds, were reacting. So I'm going to end it a couple more images, but I just wanted to. I'll go through quickly some of the images to basically illustrate this in a more visual pattern. So here's a Solomon seal. There's the seeds. There's the composition underneath it. Again, there's geranium. There's Euchera villosa. There's the Solomon seal in the middle. This is what's going on in this property. And I'll end it with this couple of images. So here is a pignut hickory tree. Didn't plant it. And you'll notice there's wood chips on that slope. Raw wood chips, which you're not supposed to put down in garden design because it eats up the nitrogen. But in nature, nobody's fertilizing or worrying about super high nitrogen levels. So at any rate, I put down wood chips. Why did I put down raw wood chips? Because there was research done at Rutgers University where they took different patches of bare ground, all the same condition and one control, and did different applications, and then inventoried what plants naturally recruited. They put sulfur to acidify, they did this, they did that. One of them was raw wood chips. And in the raw wood chips, they got a higher number of trees, but they weren't only any trees, and they weren't pioneer trees like you would expect to see the first trees coming up in bare soil, sassafras, birch. They were what you would trees associated with a more mature canopy like oak and hickory. Now, I have a mature white oak in the backyard, and I have one right off property, a pignut hickory, that are both over 100 years old. So I have seed sources, and I also know that the small mammals that plant the seeds don't go more than like 30 yards, but they're close enough. So I got a seed source, and Rutgers is telling me if I put down raw wood chips, I'm going to get late stage forest species. I got the seed source, so I put the wood chips down, and I got three white oaks, actually scarlet, which I have a scarlet oak in the front too, and the pignut hickory. Now, I've only had one oak naturally recruit on my property for the 34 years I've been there, and I put wood chips down, I got three. Hickory, I've never seen a hickory naturally recruit on my property in 34 years. That's the only one that's ever come up, right where the wood chips were put down. Elsewhere, there was a tree that came down and ripped up the vegetation, and I got sassafras, which you would expect as a disturbance, early disturbance species. Somewhere else, I put pea gravel for the sole reason of keeping my dog's paws clean, because that's where he used to go to the bathroom and then come in. And I got like a little ground cover of cherries. And I learned from an ornithologist that birds ingest that small pea gravel, pass it through their systems. Again, Doug, correct me if I'm getting it wrong. But they were hanging around a lot, and they eat berries and they eat cherries. And so I had cherries. So raw wood chips, I got oaks and hickories. A natural disturbance, I got the expected species, the pioneer tree of sassafras. Pea gravel, I got cherries. You know, we don't need to necessarily plant everything. So here's my little grove of oaks and hickory on that slope. And I went visiting another property that I had worked on a long time ago and planted those trees. And they were planted at pretty big caliber size. And when I was there, I realized that the year that because of an occurrence that had happened that year, I realized, it was memorable, I realized that I had planted those heavy, large caliber trees the same year I put the wood chips down. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to measure these trees. And I did. And then I went back home. And those are the ones that came from the wood chips. They were significantly bigger. Think about that. Trees planted caliber size were significantly smaller than trees that were planted by acorns and hickory nuts by a chipmunk or a squirrel. You know, we buy trees. Tennessee is a big nursery production state. You go to a garden center and buy a tree. It might have been grown in a nursery in Tennessee, machine loaded it on a truck. A truck drove through 7-8 states, through forests of oaks and hickories that nobody planted, drops the trees off at a garden center or a nursery wholesale yard, and the towers are watering it, and water's going all over the place in addition to the trees. And then a landscape contractor's truck comes and picks up the tree, drives it to the house, machine comes, takes it to the backyard, digs a big disturbance hole, creates a disturbance to get back there, plants the tree, and you could have a bigger tree if you just let a chipmunk plant the same day. And chipmunks, the labor rate is very low. You want to beat inflation? There you go. Now, am I saying that we don't plant trees anymore? No. Because if you look in the bottom left there's a pagoda dogwood. I'm not going to pray to the dogwood gods to grant me a pagoda dogwood. I'm not going to get one, and so I'm going to plant a pagoda dogwood. So the idea here is basically to integrate planting with strategies. Can I have 5 more minutes to just kind of finish up? Okay. We kind of had some time changes of the time I had here. I am going to, oops. No, we're good. This will only take a few. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't. Okay. So some of the things that I do are counter what you've learned in horticulture. If you're a good weeder, you pull the plant by the roots and you get them all out. Once I have a dense vegetative cover, such as you see on that bank here that used to have cardinal flower and columbine, once I have a dense vegetative cover, except for the most pernicious weeds like a mugwort or a Japanese knotweed, I would rather cut that weed at the base, underneath the existing vegetation. Only if you've got a dense cover, not in a mulch bed. Why? Because if I cut it at the base, it's in dense shade underneath. Now, it could grow back, but the next weeding session, you cut it at the base again. Cutting at the base takes a fraction of the time of pulling by the roots. But the real reason I'm saying don't pull by the roots unless it's a weed that is absolutely overly aggressive, because when you pull by the roots, you create a disturbance. Disturbance is open soil. Open soil means seed germination. And if the seed soil bank is dominated by weeds, when you pull a weed, you get 12 weeds. And you pull those 12 weeds, and it's a never-ending cycle of weeding. The idea is to try to replicate what the ecological term, which would be relative ecological stability, at the point where a vegetative composition has become stable because the species are mature and dominant and suppressive. And the term relative is important because no landscape plant composition in nature is absolutely stable and doesn't change. Relative means it's slowly changing, meaning slow incursion of new plants, meaning if the seed soil bank is full of weeds, then relative ecological stability is exactly the same as low maintenance in the garden world. But let's go forward to what my landscape is now. If I pull a weed by the roots and create a disturbance, I'm probably going to get a native plant. And if you ask an ecologist, is disturbance good or bad? Well, there's various ways to look at it, but if your weed seed if it's mostly weed seeds, it's bad. If it's mostly desirable plants, it's good. And an ecologist would say, what's the most desirable ecological disturbance regime, which is the ecological term for disturbance. A disturbance regime, a huge disturbance is a bulldozer or a massive storm. A little disturbance would be little tiny ones, disturbance regime. Also, how frequent are they? An ecologist would say, ideally, they wouldn't say no disturbance. He wouldn't say massive upheaval. They'd say little scattered disturbance, occasional scattered disturbances, which is weeding. Why do they say that? Because a perennial plant composition is senescing, because it's suppressing the seeds of the replacement plants. If you look at a woods, you want to see sapling trees to replace other trees if they blow down or die. Well, it's the same in an herbaceous composition. If you have a dense perennial composition that is coming back year after year and suppressing germination, the vast majority of those plants are senescing, and there's no replacements. But you pull a few weeds here and there, you're creating a little disturbances here and there. So weeding now is a little different. Down in the bottom, not on the top. I just cut on the top because it's quick and easy. Down on the bottom where on the terrace, I'm a little more fastidious about what I want and what I don't want. I've started, pulling some weeds now, let some new things come in, But at any rate, it's kind of this idea of reading the landscape and understanding what's going on and using that understanding to put together very concrete strategies to push certain species into increased proliferation and try to suppress other ones. So I will end it there. And I appreciate all that folks are doing here at J Heritage. Appreciate your interest, and thank you very much.
So our next speaker, Doug Tallamy, is going to talk about his new book, Nature of Oaks. He really doesn't need any introduction, so I'm not going to make a long one. Let's just hear him speak. But he's also the author of Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope. He's an entomologist at the University of Delaware, and he's spoken here. I think this is the third program you've done with us. The second, yeah, well, you did one in person here, and then we did a great Zoom program during the pandemic that's still online. I'll actually email it to all of you because I have your emails from registering this. We have the recording of it, and it's a program that Doug did with Andy Revkin from the Earth Institute at Columbia and Eric Sanderson, and it was moderated by our trustee Sarah Goddard. It was a really great program from like a year ago, so I'll send that around so you have it as well. But without further ado, Doug Tallamy.
Thanks very much. Before you ask me whether my neighbors are doing what I'm doing, my neighbor hired Larry Weaner's company. So that's 10 acres. That's going to be not finished yet, but that's good. Now, Larry says he's not a plant nerd, he's a space nerd. I'm just a general nerd, a well-rounded nerd. All right, I want to talk about the nature of oaks, specifically the species that are associated with the oaks, the species that depend on oaks. Oh. I have to hold this because it's a pointer, but I have to do this to advance it. All right. Before we do that, though, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson reminded us way back in 1987, that insects are the little things that run the world. The problem today, though, is that we are losing our insects. We've already lost over 45% of the insects on planet Earth. And we're doing that because lights kill insects. Neonicotinoids kill insects, and that's where we're using neonicotinoids. By the way, they are 7,000 times more toxic to insects than DDT was. Deforestation kills insects, cars kill insects, climate change kills insects. When you take an area like this and you turn it into that, it kills insects. What does this have to do with oaks? Well, there's no better way to share our spaces with the insects that run the world than to put oaks into those spaces. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to follow some oaks that we planted on our property, where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000. In Oxford, Pennsylvania. It was a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots, and it had been mowed for hay for several years before we bought it. But when you mow hay in southeast Pennsylvania, you're mowing autumn olive and multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle roots. And when you stop mowing it, and that's okay because they take that stuff and they give it to the mushroom industry, so it really doesn't matter what it is. But when you stop mowing, that all comes back. So when we actually moved in, that's what our property looked like. So I asked Cindy to get rid of that stuff. And she did. 10 acres. Now it takes, people look at that and they say, it's impossible, I can't do it. It's not impossible. There she is, it's gone. But it takes a lot of work. And of course, once it's gone, that's opening up all those niches that Larry talked about. So I guess it was the first September after we moved in, there were a couple of white oaks about 1.5 miles down the street. They dropped some acorns. So, easy. I gathered up some acorns, planted them. This is what they do in the beginning. White oaks germinate in the fall. Red oaks germinate in the spring. So you have to know which species you have. And they just put down a single root, as you see here. It's called a radical. And then in the spring, they put up one set of leaves, and that's all they do. And it gives people the impression that oaks grow really slowly. They're not growing that slowly. They're just doing most of their growth beneath the ground. In the first year of growth, oaks are putting in 10 times more root biomass than above ground biomass. And that is the root mass that will accelerate growth in the years to come. Now that's the little oak that we're following right there. It's got a deer cage on it. If you don't put a cage around your oaks, no matter where you live these days, the deer are going to, except Larry's house. You don't have any deer, do you?
We do now.
Ah, okay. Good. We got to even things out. So that's what it looked like in year 2. That's what it looked like 18 years later. It's 45 feet tall, 47-inch circumference, canopy spread of 30 feet. Still a baby, of course, but it's a real landscape plant. You didn't have to wait that long for it. Now, one of the points I want to make today is that, and this is the most important point, oaks are a lifeline to an awful lot of creatures. There are dozens of species of birds that depend on oaks. There are lots of mammals, including rodents, but the big guys too. Bears, when we had the giant oaks in the forest, they would spend the winter in the hollow spaces in those oaks. Raccoons, possums. Not that many reptiles are associated with oaks, but there's several species of butterflies that are specialists on oaks, and hundreds of species of moths that are associated with oaks, and then all the predators and parasitoids that attack those moths. Cynipid gall wasps, we'll talk about them. Beetles, June beetles, longhorn beetles, metallic wood-boring beetles, weevils, all associated with oaks. And then you look underneath the tree in the leaf litter, and you've got lots of spiders, dozens more species of arthropods, mollusks, annelids, all kinds of things that are depending on the leaf litter. So you have a very complex community of life associated with the oaks on your property. And the problem is that this diverse association of life is typically unnoticed. And if it's unnoticed, it's certainly unappreciated. And that's why I wrote the book, The Nature of Oaks. It's a month-by-month guide to the life on your oaks. And the idea was to provide the knowledge with hopes that it generated interest. And if you have interest, sometimes that leads to compassion, and we need a lot more compassion towards the natural world these days. So first, a few facts. The genus Quercus is a large one. It contains 91 species in North America, 435 species globally. There are 200 species of oaks in Mexico alone. The word Quercus comes from the Celtic quer, meaning fine, ques meaning tree, and oaks are fine trees. There are 4 major taxonomic sections in North America, and we hear about these, so we'll talk about them. There's the white oak group, the Quercus group, the red oak group, the Lobate. Live oak group is Verentes, and a much smaller canyon oak group called Protobalanus. That is the distribution of oaks in North America. They occur everywhere except where it's brown. And certainly the center of distribution in North America is the southeast, where you've got lots and lots of species, although there are 38 species of oaks in California alone. Oaks live a lot longer than we give them credit for. 900-year average life cycle. 300 years of growth, 300 years of stasis, and 300 years of decline. So when your neighbor says, I've got a 100-year-old oak in my yard, it's ready to fall down, it's still a baby. Don't cut it down yet. During each one of those periods of growth, they're delivering unique ecological services. Now, there are reasons our oaks don't live that long anymore, and they're us. We're the reasons, so we'll talk about some of the things that discourage long life these days. What's the oldest oak in the country? A number of specimens are competing for that, but a lot of people agree it's the Penchenka oak in California, a coastal live oak, estimated to be 2,000 years old. But there are low-growing, ground-hugging oaks. They look like ground covers, like the Palmer oak, also in California. They root in one area, then they'll move along and die here, but they're rooted over here, and they just keep going. And that specimen is estimated to be 13,000 years old. So some of the very oldest things on the planet are actually oaks. Oaks can get huge. This was the Y oak in Y, Maryland, the largest white oak in the country. I did get to see it before it fell over. Anybody else get to see the Y oak? Nobody? Well, it was big. But the point is, well, it fell over about 20 years ago in a hurricane. Not all oaks are huge, and that's important because many of us have small properties and we want to be able to put oaks in them. So we'll talk about that as well. And then finally, we're going to stress the fact that oaks have superior ecological function. By that I mean they've got the highest biodiversity value. They are supporting more species than any other tree genus. They're sequestering more carbon dioxide. That's good, pulling the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, building their tissues out of it. Oaks have very dense tissues, so they can hold a lot of carbon. But even more important, they're pumping the extra carbon into the soil through their root system. And once it's in the soil, it's extremely stable. It'll stay there thousands of years. So oaks are fighters of climate change. They are the best soil stabilizers because of those big root systems. They make the best leaf litter in that it lasts the longest. When you have, a single leaf will take up to 3 years to break down. But, maple leaves and birch leaves and tulip tree leaves, they don't even make it through a single season, and then you have bare soil, and that's not good. And all of that promotes healthier watersheds. Now, I started the book in October. Everybody wants to know why I started in October, because that's when Cindy said you should write a book about oaks. And it was October, and I looked out the window, and there's the oak. Of course, October is when we think about acorns. The trees are dropping their acorns. That's the most notable feature about oaks, is their acorns. They can make a lot of acorns. A single specimen can make up to 3 million acorns in its lifetime. And each one of those acorns is a distinct package of very valuable food that supports a lot of wildlife. It's very high in fat and very high in protein. And again, many mammals depend on that. All kinds of rodents do, but the big guys as well. Our black bears are running around the woods eating as many acorns as they can to put on the fat that they need to make it through the winter. So are our squirrels. So are those cute deer. But so are turkeys. That's why turkeys are running around the woods. They're eating as many acorns as they can for the very same reason. So it's not just turkeys that like acorns. A lot of birds do. Red-bellied woodpeckers, titmice, towhees, nuthatches, flickers, lots of birds, especially ducks, especially wood ducks. In an acorn, if it's viable, it sinks. If it floats, it's not viable. But if it's viable, it sinks. The wood ducks will swim down to the bottom of the lake or the stream and get the acorns, or they'll come right up on the shore and eat as many acorns as they can. A lot of invertebrates depend on acorns as well. This is the acorn weevil tunneling its way out of the acorn, and that is what the acorn weevil adult looks like. They can be really common in acorns. And another group of insects, acorn moths, are doing the same thing. The caterpillar develops in the acorn, and then it tunnels out and becomes a moth that looks like that. It's actually several species, but they are so closely related and they look just like each other. You need DNA to separate them. So you have all these things eating acorns. If you look under a tree, maybe 2 weeks after they start to drop, it's utter destruction. All the acorns are eaten or carried away or squished, and you might wonder how oaks ever successfully reproduce. This is where a very ancient mutualism between jays and oaks comes into play. Both those lineages evolved at the same time, about 56 million years ago, in what is now the Arctic. It wasn't the Arctic then. And right away, they liked each other. The jays liked oaks because they provide those acorns, all the winter food that they need. Oaks like jays because jays allow oaks to move, to disperse farther and faster than any other tree genus in the world. And this is how that happens. Jays, of course, are storing the acorns for winter use. They're not eating them all in the fall. They're going to store them. They don't cache them like a squirrel. They're not going to put a bunch in one place. They will bury them singly in different places. So they pick one up from under the tree, and they'll fly up to a mile from the parent tree. And that's the key. No other acorn disperser will actually move acorns that far. People think squirrels are dispersing acorns. They'll cache them, but people have followed them. They eat just about every single one. So there's very few acorns that actually survive squirrel use. The jay flies up to a mile, then it finds a disturbed area and taps the acorn beneath the soil surface. Now, if a jay thinks that another jay watched them do that, they'll wait a few minutes, then they'll dig up their acorn and move it. Because jays know that jays steal acorns. And then, of course, during the wintertime, they're going to go back and get those acorns. Now, they're working really hard in the fall. A single jay can bury up to 4,500 acorns. But it only remembers where 1 out of every 4 is. Which means a single jay can actually plant 3,360 oak trees. And if they're doing that a mile from the parent tree, that's what allows oaks to disperse faster than other trees. And of course, when the glaciers came down and pushed the trees all the way down to the Gulf Coast, or into Mexico, when they receded, the plants had to return, and oaks led the way. It's not just blue jays doing this. We've got 7 or 8 species of jays in North America. All the species have a relationship with acorns. This is a scrub jay in Oregon doing the same thing. We also have acorn woodpeckers in the Southwest, very beautiful bird that has a very similar relationship with acorns. They're going to store those acorns over the winter so they have something to eat. But they don't store them underground. They create what we call acorn trees. They find a snag, something that's dead, and they carve out a whole bunch of little holes and then store the acorns in those holes during the wintertime. So they're not beneath the ground, but they're there. And in the Southwest, it's dry, and that works for them. But it takes a long time to carve those little holes in the trees. So an acorn tree becomes a valuable resource for a family of acorn woodpeckers. They all work together. It's a social group, and they will protect their acorn tree because it's got up to 50,000 holes in it. And they don't want any other acorn woodpeckers coming along and taking their tree. So if you happen to have an acorn tree in the back of your house or the front of your house, it's enormously entertaining. Okay, November is when you might look back and say, well, gee, there were a lot of acorns this year, or not very many at all. And that's, it's not unheard of among plants, but it's an unusual way of reproducing, kind of an all or nothing. When you have an all, when you have a lot of acorns produced, it's called a mast year. And when you don't make many acorns at all, nobody calls it anything. But why do plants mast? Why do oaks mast? This is what ecologists do. They sit and they make up stories and try to verify them. But these are 4 hypotheses that are out there to describe oak masts: predator satiation, predator reduction, improved pollination, and energy partitioning. And they are not mutually exclusive. They all could be operating at the same time. So predator satiation, it's coupled with predator reduction. That's an acorn weevil outside of the acorn. They can be really numerous, as I said before. Up to 90% of the acorns on a tree can have an acorn weevil in them. Now, if oaks made all the same number of acorns every single year, the population of acorn weevils and acorn moths and squirrels and everything else that eats acorns would stabilize around that constant number. And they'd eat just about all the acorns. But if oaks are really variable in how they make their acorns, so if they have a mast year, you'll make a ton of acorn weevils, a whole bunch of squirrels, and then the next year you make almost no acorns, those populations crash. That's called predator reduction. There really is mass starvation. And then it's typically several years of very few acorns, so it keeps those predator populations low, and then you have another mast year. That's predator satiation. Then there's far more acorns than the acorn eaters that are around, and they have successful reproduction. Okay, improved pollination. Oaks are wind pollinated. Those are the male catkins. They just drop their pollen on the wind, and that, of course, is a game of chance. It's got to get to the female flowers. Those are female flowers up there, tiny little inconspicuous things. You don't even notice them. A single oak tree drops its pollen before its female flowers have matured, so it cannot fertilize itself. It depends on the pollen from another tree. But if all of the oaks in the same area are releasing their pollen at the same time, the chances that a pollen will reach the female flower at the right time are greatly increased. And then finally, energy allocation. And by the way, if you're wondering whether oaks can have good fall color, they can. That's a scarlet oak in my yard. Energy allocation. There's never enough energy to go around, so oaks partition it. They either put it mostly towards reproduction and very little towards growth, or a lot towards growth and very little towards reproduction. But rarely do they do both at the same time. Again, those four hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. They all could be operating together to explain oak masting. Now, December is when you might look at your oak and recognize it's doing another thing which is unusual among deciduous trees, and that is it doesn't drop its leaves. This is particularly common in the white oak group, and particularly common in younger trees in the white oak group. They're holding their leaves all winter long. Unusual for a deciduous tree, so why are they doing that? Well, again, ecologists want to explain that, and the leading hypothesis is that it wasn't long ago, 8, 9, 10,000 years ago, when the world was filled with very large Pleistocene mammals. That's the group of mammals that was in Mexico alone. 3 species of mastodon, mammoth-type elephants, the giant sloth that could reach up 18 feet, camels, horses, elk. I think the world had 44 species of rhinoceros back then. And many of these guys were browsers, just like the white-tailed deer today. White-tailed deer is not out in your lawn eating grass. It's eating woody material, particularly during the wintertime, particularly buds, because that's where the nutrition is, where the nitrogen is for next year's growth. So the thinking is that oaks surrounded their buds of next year with the last year's dead leaves that aren't very tasty. So it's very difficult to get a mouthful of bud without a mouthful of dead leaves, and it discouraged herbivory. And the distribution of marcescent leaves goes up about 18 feet. That's as far as those mammals could reach, and it supports that hypothesis. Difficult, impossible to test these days, but it does make a nice story. And marcescence gives oaks a very handy landscape trait that you can use. It's a good screen, even in the wintertime. So if you don't like your neighbors, you want to screen them out, put a white oak in. It will work all year round. Okay, January. It's cold. We're usually not out looking up in our oak trees, but if we do go out and stare at our oak trees, often we see little birds hopping around. In the cold, things like chickadees and titmice, things like the golden-crowned kinglet, flitting around the trees. Now, chickadees and titmice are at our feeders. They're eating seeds. But only 50% of their diet is seeds in the wintertime. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. So maybe they're getting insects and spiders in our oak trees. But we entomologists know there's no insects up in the oak trees, so what are they doing up there? And the kinglet should have migrated. It doesn't eat seeds at all. It is an insectivore all year round. It's smaller than a chickadee, so it's got to eat constantly. What is a bird that needs insects all year round doing in the north? That's called the kinglet paradox. But Bernheinrich, he's a retired entomologist, but he's a great naturalist. He writes a column in Natural History every month. He does not like paradoxes, so he actually looked in the crops of golden crowned kinglets in Maine in January, and he found they were full of caterpillars in Maine in January. Where are they getting those caterpillars? They're up in the tree. They look like sticks just sitting there, and many of them really look like sticks. So we didn't know they were there, but they are there. When it gets really cold, there it is. There are antifreeze proteins in the cells of these caterpillars. So it keeps the cells from bursting, but the caterpillar shrinks a little bit, and then it gets a little bit warmer, and it swells a little bit. But it's just sitting there all winter long, not eating anything, because there really is nothing to eat. So we don't have a kinglet paradox anymore. The kinglets are here because there is food, and that's what they're depending on. The next question is, what are the caterpillars doing up there all winter long when there really is nothing to eat? And again, we don't know, but here's my guess. Of course, in the spring, those leaves burst forth. If you overwinter as an egg, as most insects do, and you hatch out your tiny little guy, you can't compete with that big caterpillar. Or if you overwinter as an adult, as some insects do, or a chrysalis or a pupa, you've got to find another adult and mate and then lay the eggs, and then they have to hatch. So those caterpillars that spend the winter almost full grown have a competitive advantage over anything else, and they've got unlimited food in the spring when those leaves burst forth. Okay, February, it's quietest time of year for oaks, so it's a good time to talk about what I call oak landscaping myths. This is where Larry can correct me when I'm wrong all the time. But I hear all the time, there are lots of reasons why people can't use oaks. They are, a lot of times associated with a myth, there actually is some facts, some truth, or at least that's the way it used to be. Oaks are too expensive. I can't use an oak because it's too expensive. I hear that all the time. I'm not going to use an oak because it grows too slowly. People say I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. Oaks are too big to use on small lots. If we do use them, they're going to fall over and crush our house. They're going to lift up our hardscape, our sidewalks, and our driveway. Fact or fiction? Let's look at each one of those. Are oaks too expensive? Well, they can be if you insist on instant gratification. And Larry actually talked about this. We want to plant big trees. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to dwell on it. There's two risks, though. One is you get a tree grown in an air pot, and you can do that without having them root bound. That's what a root bound tree looks like. You never want to plant one of those because the roots are going to keep growing and strangle the tree. But we can grow tall trees in pots without them being root bound. But you have a very small amount of root mass compared to the above ground biomass that you have to support. I came across this planting of oaks in Newark, Delaware, a couple years ago. There were at least 10 oaks there. Everyone was dead. Somebody spent a lot of money, and it didn't work out so well. The other option, of course, is balled and burlap, where you simply chop off all the roots and you wrap it up in burlap, and then you sell it. So as Larry said, if you plant an acorn the same day that you plant one of these big balled and burlap trees, which have to sit there and rebuild that root mass before they can grow at all, at the end of 10 years, your acorn's gonna look like that. It's gonna be much bigger and healthier than your balled and burlap tree. A little bit of exaggeration, but Larry is right. It will be a stronger and much healthier tree, and it's gonna grow much faster. This is a great size to plant an oak if you don't want to start from an acorn. I'm not trying to kill the big tree industry, but I'd love to add this to the tree industry, because there's a whole bunch of people that are not going to spend a lot of money on an oak, but they will spend $20 on a tree that's 5 inches tall. So I'd love to add that to the nursery trade. But that brings up the next question: do oaks grow too slowly? Are we really going to be dead before we can appreciate them? Well, let's have a race here. This is the oak we're following. It's 6 years old there, and this is my little friend Bella. No, she's not my daughter, and she's not my granddaughter, but she was our surrogate granddaughter before we found real ones. She was born on Cindy's birthday, and we spent a lot of time with Bella in the early years, and she really liked this oak tree. So we're going to have a race. Bella's 2 years old here. The oak is 6 years old, but we know white oaks grow really, really slowly, so maybe Bella will be able to beat it. So there it is at 6 years old, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, Bella's losing. 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 2020. Bella's got a mask on, so we know what year it is. Bella has lost, but she did, she tried. She's 5'11". So I'm going to throw that. That's a complete myth that oaks grow too slowly. They grow slowly the first couple of years, and then they take off and grow as fast as any other tree. And a really important point, they start to contribute energy to your local food web right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and there's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves at that tree the very first year. And then a bird's going to come and eat that caterpillar. So you don't have to wait decades or centuries for your oak to start to contribute to your local landscape. You just need a little bit of patience. It's happening right away. Are oaks too large to use in small yards? Well, nobody's going to recommend a large oak for a small yard, but they used to. This is a whole street that I drive into the University of Delaware, past them. Those are two big red oaks there. There's a big pin oak down the street in yards that are not much bigger than the trunk of the tree. And I'm sure they were planted when that house was built, and it was probably more than 100 years ago. But remember, 100 years ago, there was no air conditioning, so those trees were lowering the temperature of that house by at least 10 degrees. It's a valuable ecosystem service back then. They have not lifted up the sidewalk. They have not fallen over and crushed the house. But again, nobody's going to recommend that. This is a large oak in front of a large church, and fortunately, they didn't cut it down. This is a large Gary oak, the Oregon oak in Portland. Again, fortunately, they didn't cut it down, but nobody's going to recommend that. Point I want to make is we've got small oak species that we need to get into the trade a little bit more prevalently. The yellow highlighted ones are the species of small oaks that occur in Texas alone. In the east here, this is the most common one, dwarf chestnut oak, Quercus prinoides. It's often in the trade. But we got blackjack oak and bluejack oak. There's a dwarf live oak. It's a subspecies of Quercus virginianum, so the great big live oaks with the Spanish moss down south, you can get a small one. We've got to get more of these in the trade so that people with small yards really can have oaks. That's the Quercus prinoides in my yard. It made acorns when it was 5 feet tall. So I could look down on it, and I like that. But this is another option here, and that's coppicing. This is something we used to, back in John Jay's day, everybody coppiced. I don't know why. I don't know what they did with all of the coppice. But what you do is you let your oak get maybe 2 or 3 inches in diameter, then cut it off at the base, and it comes back as a bush. So you can have the foliage of any species of oak in your yard, and you can coppice it for 100 years. You see cutting off the leader, and it will give you vegetation in a small space. And if you want to see what that looks like, find a decent beaver pond, because they're coppicing things all the time, and they come back as bushes. I don't know, I found this picture on the web, so I don't know anybody who's actually done it, but try it, and then I'll come take a picture. All right, are oaks going to fall over and crush our houses? They can, not just oaks, but any tree. And if they do, we'll hear about it on the news. There's a rule. The news is always bad. They will never tell you about the oak that did not fall over and crush your house. But the reason our trees are falling over, and it seems like more and more these days, is because of the way we plant them. We plant every tree so that it will be a specimen tree. It will not interact with any other tree, compete for moisture or nutrients or light, so that it can attain its full splendor. But when we do that, and you get a lot of rain and a lot of wind, the tree blows over because its roots were not able to stabilize with any other tree. This is the way most trees grow in a forest. They grow close enough together that their roots form a matrix. And it anchors those trees. You get the big wind, it can snap them off, but it won't blow them over. This is a stream cut near my house where the stream has washed away the soil, and that is 1, 2, 3, 4 trees, all really interlocked with each other, extremely stable. So instead of this, let's consider this. These are the 2 white oaks that I got the original acorns from at my house down the road. Nobody planted them. They are 3 feet apart. They put the road in after those trees were there. But if you walk into the forest, you see trees close together all the time. Michelle, are you still here? Oh, she is. Michelle Alfendown, co-founder of Homegrown National Park. She sent me this picture. These are the three sisters in Northwest Connecticut. 3 big red oaks growing right next to each other. So it actually is quite common. Now this is a designed landscape. This is Mount Cuba Center, one of the DuPont estates, and this one's dedicated to native plants. We've got a large red oak here and a bunch of hemlocks and big rhodies down here with hardscape. That was designed, that was planted. It looks natural, it's beautiful. We're viewing it as a grove of trees. They don't have to be the same species, but they were planted young and they could interlock their roots, extremely stable, and it forms a great habitat for lots of creatures. If you have several acres of lawn and you're wondering what to do with it, think about a tree grove that will be aesthetically pleasing and also ecologically functional. Are your oaks going to lift up your hardscape? They can, depending on what you plant them over. If you plant them over bedrock, yeah, the roots will go laterally. They can't go through the rock. If you plant them over agricultural pan, so if you know your house was built over an old farm, pan is when the plow went down maybe 15, 18 inches for a couple centuries, and the soil beneath where the plow touched got really compacted. That's called pan. The roots go down and hit pan, and then they go laterally. So if you know you're over agricultural pan, break it up. You can get a pickaxe and break it up, or a ripper. It's a big hook you put on the back of a tractor, and it rips it up. And then the roots will go deep, no problem. So this is a pin oak right here, not lifting up that driveway or that street at all. These are 2 big red oaks at the University of Delaware. Big trees right next to the curb, no problem. If you give the roots space, they will go down. Okay, March, this is when our marcescent leaves actually start to fall to the ground and do what leaves are supposed to do. First, let's talk about variability in oak leaves. There's a lot of variability in oak leaves. A lot of people think that all oaks have lobed leaves, but they don't. Many of the more common ones around here do, but look, that's a shingle oak there, that's a chestnut oak, that's a water oak, that's an emery oak from the southwest, looks like a holly leaf. Willow oak looks like a willow leaf, that's a live oak leaf. So not all oak leaves are lobed. And oaks make a lot of leaves. 700,000 leaves on a mature tree, and if you line them all up on a tennis court, they're going to cover 4 tennis courts, and that's their job, to cover the ground, to protect the soil community. Our soil community is extremely important. It's undervalued because we can't see it and in all the tiny things in there. But you're talking about all the detritivores that turn over the nutrients so your tree can use them again. You're talking about the mycorrhizal associations that transfer the nutrients to the tree so they can use them. They all depend on high humidity. And that's what we want to cover the ground for, so that we have a high humidity and we give a place for those creatures to live. When we rake our leaves away, we're throwing away the nutrients that your tree needs, and you're opening up the soil to drying out and to erosion, to overheating, and you kill the soil community. But we worry, if we put leaves on our flower beds, the plants won't be able to get through. I stopped and took this picture. That is a big white oak. It's a totally natural situation. I don't want to call that a fern planting because nobody planted it. Those ferns just come through on their own, normal layers of oak leaf litter. These are wood poppies at my house. I'm never home, so I don't get to rake. And they come through just fine. This is a native Pachysandra, Virginia creeper. Lots of things do very well in normal layers of oak leaf litter. And there's a lot of things that live in leaf litter. There are more species beneath the ground than above the ground. In 1 square meter of oak leaf litter, you've got 250,000 mites, 100,000 springtails. Those are collembolans. That's a little sminthurid collembolan. 90,000 proturans. Those are primitive insects, tiny little white things. 1 million nematodes. That's a lot of life in one square meter. And that is what you're throwing away when you rake up your leaves and put it out to the curb as if it was garbage. And then you have the nerve to go buy mulch someplace else. It's the perfect mulch. You're also throwing away what beautiful butterflies like the banded hair streak depends on. That's a pretty common hair streak. We get to see it. That's what its caterpillars eat, dead leaves on the ground, only if we leave them there. And there are 70 species of what we call litter moths. Things like the ambiguous litter moth, the American idea, the dark-spotted palthus, and 67 other species eating the dead leaves on our ground, only if we leave them there. When you see the white-throated sparrows and the towhees and the other things doing a dance in your leaf litter, they're kicking it back so they can find these guys, they can find their caterpillars. They can find the predators that are in there eating all of that community that's in the leaf litter. And when we throw that stuff away, we're throwing away what those birds need. We're also throwing away what our fireflies, our lightning bugs need. I get asked all the time, how come I don't see fireflies like I used to? They're not flies and they're not bugs, they're beetles, and that's what the adult looks like. There's the lantern that they talk to each other with, but that's what a firefly larva looks like. It's a predator in leaf litter where it eats worms and mostly slugs and snails and things, but it's only there if you leave the leaf litter there. Okay, April, this is when the buds just start to break out, open. And it's the chance for you to see one of the most ephemeral interactions in all of nature. It takes about 5 minutes a year. Happens a lot during that 5 minutes, but you have to be there in the right 5 minutes. And I'm talking about when synipid gall wasps actually lay their eggs in the buds of oaks. And that's what's going on here. That's a female synipid, so they're the ones that make the galls on our trees. She's got a little ovipositor there. She's injecting an egg into the bud. This is a male who is riding her. Now, he's already mated with her, so the egg she's putting in that bud is fathered by this guy. But he's sticking around because she's going to go to another bud and lay another egg, and he wants to be the father of that bud, too. This is a male who wishes he was that male. So here she is. She's injecting her egg into the bud, but she's also injecting plant hormones, and that will stimulate the growth of all the undifferentiated cells in that bud there. They're called meristematic cells. So she's directing the growth, but so is the oak. The oak has its own plant hormones, and the resulting shape that occurs is a species-specific shape we call a gall. People say it's like a cancerous growth, but cancerous growth is uncontrolled growth. This is highly controlled growth. And it's so species-specific that I can look at any gall, well, people can look at any gall and recognize the species of galler that made it, because it will always be the same. A lot of variation. Oh, it's not that one, sorry. There are a lot of galls out there, 1,000 species of synipid gallers. A single oak tree can have up to 70 species of galls on it. It's very difficult to find an oak tree with no galls on it. And many of these galls are hollow. This is the apple oak gall or the oak apple gall. I've seen it written both ways. And if you cut it open, it's largely air. So in the middle here is a sphere, and inside that sphere is where the gall larva is, the galler larva is. And then you've got a lot of space in the outside of the gall. What's that all about? Well, it turns out that synipid gall wasps are attacked by natural enemies, more natural enemies than any other type of insect. So these are mostly parasitoids that are laying their eggs in the larvae of the synipid gallers. This is a pterimid wasp. It's one of the species, and she's got a very long ovipositor here. So the space between the galler and the outside of the gall has to be bigger than the length of that ovipositor, otherwise she can reach it. Now, in the beginning, the galls are small, and they are vulnerable. That's when the synipid, that's when the parasitoid can actually reach the synipid. But they grow really, really quickly to get the galler beyond the reach of that ovipositor. This is a pterimid from the west coast. It has the largest ovipositor of all the pterimids, and the length of that ovipositor has created the biggest gall in the country, which you find on Gary oaks, on the, what's it called, the Oregon white oak. A lot of variation in gall shape and size. Many of them are round spheres that are found on leaves. Others are round spheres that are found on stems. Some look like candy. Some look like that. Many of them look like plant diseases. That's the spindle gall, more candy. This is one that's found in my yard. Looks like pottery. This is my favorite, the little gnome house gall. Brain gall. This is an interesting one where there's 4 galls on a single leaf, and the galler laid a bunch of eggs, not just one, and those are the emergence holes of all the adults that came out. So that one leaf made hundreds of gall wasps. And there's an interesting role that galls have played in our recorded history. If you grind up a gall like that and combine it with certain chemicals, and I forget what they are, it forms an indelible ink. Black ink, and that is the ink that all of recorded history has been recorded with. So the Bible was written with gall ink, the Magna Carta was written with gall ink, the Declaration of Independence was written with gall ink. John Jay wrote everything with gall ink. So that's something you can use at your next cocktail party. All right, May is when the leaves really expand, and following the expansion of those leaves all over the temperate zone comes the caterpillars that eat those leaves, and following the caterpillars that eat those leaves comes the birds that eat those caterpillars. It is no coincidence that bird migration in the spring follows the expansion of the leaves and the appearance of those caterpillars. Remember, in the spring there are no seeds and there are no berries. The birds haven't made, or the plants haven't made them yet. It's insects, largely caterpillars, that are driving bird migration. And birders know where you go to find warblers. They go where the food is, and the food is where the oaks are. I had a student look at this, Christy Beal, several years ago. These are plant families of large trees in cemeteries. The first one's Fagaceae here, so that's the oaks, the chestnuts, and the beeches. But there were no chestnuts and beeches in her sample size. So this is all oaks here, and that's the number of minutes that warblers are foraging in those trees. So oaks, pines, birches, clearly they're spending their time in the oaks because that is where the caterpillars are. Things like the the purple-crested slug, the buck moth, the white-marked tussock moth, the saddle prominent, double-line prominent, white-dotted prominent, the checkered fringe prominent, the laugher, the lace-cap caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the skiff moth, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the banded tussock moth, the red-line panapoda, the yellow-neck caterpillar, the smaller parassa, the unicorn caterpillar, the crown slug. These guys are called slugs because their head is tucked up underneath, not because they're really slugs. The streaked dagger moth, the epilated dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the confused wood grain, the spiny oak slug, and this is my favorite, the spun glass slug caterpillar. And then literally hundreds more species are on the oaks in your yard right here. I've been counting the number of moth species that are using the plants in our yard that we have put back. Remember what the first picture looked like? There weren't any plants there. We've got plants there now. I'm up to 1,196 species that I've found so far, and I'm still adding them, so who knows when it's going to stop. 28% of them use oaks. Only 1.5% of the woody plant diversity on our property is oaks. So it shows you how powerful oaks are in terms of supporting these plants. And because so many of those caterpillars are types of bird food, we've recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. So this type of restoration, focusing on oaks, really works. And that's why I call oaks keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is? The keystone is a stone in the middle of the Roman arch. If you take it out of the arch falls down. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, if you take your oaks out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they're making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. Oaks are the number one keystone plant in the country. They support over 950 species of caterpillars nationwide. If I compare that to tulip trees, good plants, but they only support 21. So there's a huge difference among our native plants. And let's just reiterate why we need caterpillars. I always talk about caterpillars, not just because I like them, but because they're transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. If you develop a landscape with not enough caterpillars, you've got a failed food web and eventually a failed ecosystem. And it's not just for the migrants, they depend on them, but so do our resident birds. The birds at our feeder all winter long, they can't feed their babies seeds. Their babies can't eat seeds. So the chickadee needs 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch to make it to the point where they leave the nest, and then they continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days after they leave the nest. Tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make one bird that's a third of an ounce. 4 pennies worth of bird. And you don't want just one bird. Okay, June is cicada month. It was cicada month at my house, but probably not up here. And I know we're a little pressed for time, so I'm going to zoom through cicada month here. But last June, we had an emergence of the 17-year periodical cicada. One thing I do want to mention is how the news media vilifies nature all the time. It's terrible. We have to fear it. If you go outside, the cougar's going to eat you. Something terrible is going to happen, including the cicadas. It's an invasion. You might consider moving before they emerge. These are things I heard. The males are going to scream so loud that you're going to go crazy and kill your babies. None of those things. The most fantastic biological event you'll ever be privileged to witness. And it was a big one. A lot of them came out. When they come out, they aerate the soil. You don't have to pay anybody to do it. But there were so many that 11 Mississippi kites flew up from someplace and ate the cicadas in Newark, Delaware for 2 weeks. Okay, they come out at night, they hang upside in the tree, and they emerge, they swing up, they expand their wings, and right now they're like soft-shelled crabs. And they're really vulnerable because their exoskeleton hasn't hardened yet. So that's why they do this at night, but they'll hang there until they can actually harden their skeleton, tan their skeleton. Then they fly off and start to do their cicada thing. The male cicada thing is to sing loudly so that he can attract females. And he wants to be the loudest male in the block because the females will go for the loudest male in the block. It's a good way to measure male quality. You can't be loud if you're a weak stick. So this guy succeeded. He got a female. Now she's going to lay her eggs. And in this case, a pin oak in my front yard. There's her ovipositor. She's jamming it into the twig. Take a pin and try to stick it into one of your oak twigs. You're going to bend the pin. She does it somehow. She gets it all the way in there. She lays an egg. Then she goes right down, lays 6, 7 eggs. And then she goes to another twig and does it again. And those, from the point where she lays eggs on out, often, not always, but often, the twig dies. That's called flagging. People get upset. The cicada is going to kill my plant. No, it's not going to kill your plant. It's going to prune your tree once every 17 years. So that's okay. Where do they like to oviposit? They'll oviposit on lots of trees, but those green bars represent different species of oaks in Newark, Delaware that had the most flagging. So they really do prefer oaks. And then they die. It takes about 3 weeks. So the real question is, why do they spend 17 years underground when the nymphs are feeding on xylem, on the xylem in roots? A single tree can have 50,000 nymphs feeding on its roots with no measurable impact on the tree. Xylem is just, it's like water. There's almost nothing in it. So cicadas really are not hurting the trees very much. And the major explanation is that, again, it's predator satiation. There is no predator that can wait 17 years in between feedings. So you have squirrels, you have birds, they eat the cicadas, but there's never enough of them to handle all the ones that come out at once. Okay, July. It's when the night chorus begins. And by the night chorus, I'm talking about katydids that come out and sing. That's a male katydid. He's going to lift up this first pair of wings and rub those sclerotized sections of the wing back and forth. There's a scraper and a file on it and make its katydid sound. Why do they do that? You know why. Because once upon a time, there was a young woman named Katy who fell in love with a handsome young man. Alas, he did not share her feelings, and he married another. Soon thereafter, he and his young bride were found poisoned in their bed. Who perpetrated the crime was never determined, but some say the insects in the trees were watching that night. Sorry, got to turn my lamp. They were watching that night, and each summer they solved the mystery by singing Katydid, Katydid. You know what it sounds like. I did a lot of camping in North Jersey as a boy, and the katydid sang me to sleep. Starting mid-July, right through August, they'll sing into September, depending on how cold it gets. The males are singing as loud as they can for the same reason. The females prefer the loudest male because it's a sign of male quality. There are 4 species of katydids in our eastern forests. That's a female that is not quite mature. She hasn't expanded her wings yet, but that's her ovipositor ready to go. And here she is. She has expanded her wings. What she's going to do is find a male, the loudest guy. She's going to mate, and then she's going to lay these big flat eggs, glue them along twigs. Sometimes you find those. These guys have already hatched, but they're usually up in the canopy, so we don't see them. And when we do, we wonder what they are. Okay, August. The katydids will sing right through August. A little bit less each night, but August is when the oak leaves are really, really tough. And it's hard for insects to use oak leaves in August. In the springtime, of course, they're soft and pliable. They're full of nutrients. Lots of things eat them then. But by August, they're like boards. They're full of lignin and tannins. So you need special adaptations if you're going to eat an oak leaf in August. And feeding together, feeding gregariously is one of the best adaptations. This is the yellowneck caterpillar. A bunch of little mouths together can get through that tough material. Here it is when it's a late instar. They're still feeding gregariously. And it's a common trait. This is the orange-humped oakworm and the pink-striped oakworm. Now, I walked around our tree in 2014 and counted the number of caterpillars on the lower branches at the end of July. And I got 410 caterpillars on the lower branches. Then I stood back and took that picture so I could ask you, how many of those caterpillars do you see? How much caterpillar damage do you see? But if I knocked on your door and said, you got 410 caterpillars, and 115 of them are the large yellow net caterpillars, most people say, get the spray can, call the man, save the tree. You don't have to save the tree. Oaks are really good at sharing part of the energy they've harnessed from the sun, and because they do, you've got other life in your yard. The other way, I met a woman, Tammany Baumgarten, in New Orleans several years ago, and she suggested that we all practice the 10-step program. Take 10 steps back from your trees, and all of your insect problems disappear. That's the distance we view our trees at. The other way to handle leaves in August, when the leaves are really tough, is to become a leaf miner. You're going to line in between the in between the tough upper and lower epidermis. This is the palisade mesophyll, the parenchymal cells, still soft and tender. That's where the nutrients are. And if you're tiny enough and skinny enough, you can eat just that. And that's what a leaf miner is. They're caterpillars, believe it or not. The egg was laid here. This is a serpentine mine because it looks like a snake. And the little guy tunneled in here. The black line is his frass, his poops. He pushes it all to the center. Then he pupates here, and that's the amount of leaf material it takes to mature that caterpillar. This is a blotched leaf mine. There's the caterpillar right there. Here it is backlit. And there it is with a very nice photo by Salvador Batanza. Doesn't look much like a caterpillar because it's got all those specialized adaptations. But when it comes out as an adult, it does look like a moth. They're tiny. This is one of the Chamameria species, solitary oak leaf miner, the gregarious oak leaf miner, oak tentiform leaf miner. A lot of species on oaks mining the leaves. Okay, September, our last month. This is when we first recognized crickets, the black guys on the ground crawling around. And by the way, if a cricket gets into your house and sings, it's good luck. Don't kill it. But there are bush and tree crickets that are up on vegetation, including your oaks, and they're usually yellowish or palish. And you know what? They're doing the same thing. That's a male, and he wants to attract a female, and he knows he's got to be the loudest male. But he cheats. He finds a hole in a leaf, or he chews a hole in a leaf, then he sticks his head through there, and he raises his wings, and he sings into that hole. Now, most leaves have a slight parabolic shape, and what that does is project the sound farther and louder than if he sang on a flat surface. So he's actually sending the female a false message, if you can believe that a male would send a female a false message. He says, I'm louder than I really am. So she comes and mates with him, and you might say, oh, she's a loser, but she's not, because he's probably the smartest male, and that might be good enough. It's also the time that you're going to see walking sticks. They're not very common. They're up in the canopy all the time, but in the fall they come down. This is one I saw in an emery oak in Arizona. They're called walking sticks because they look like sticks and they walk. This is the species that we have in the east here. Only one species in the east. They do a couple interesting things. One thing the female do is they walk around the canopy and they drop eggs to the forest floor. Some of those eggs will hatch that year, some will hatch the next year, and some will hatch the year after that. That's called bet hedging. They're hedging their bets, yeah. Because who knows what the situation's going to be like in any given year, and this way she'll get some through. They also have a relationship with ants in the same way that spring ephemerals do. This is a bloodroot, of course, and bloodroots make their little pods, and inside those pods are pretty seeds, and on those seeds are what we call eliosomes, little fleshy structures that the ants love. So the ants come along and pick up the seed. They're going to take it back to the nest where they all will eat the eliosome. Then they can't eat the seed, so they throw the seed in the garbage dump of the ant nest, which is about an inch below the surface of the soil, and it's a perfect place for the bloodroot and other spring ephemerals to germinate. Well, that's what walking stick eggs look like. They've got a white stripe, just kind of like a eliosome. I'm pretty sure there's some chemical mimicry going on here, too. And the ants come, pick it up, they take it back to the nest. They can't eat it, so they throw it in the garbage dump. It's a perfect place for those eggs to hatch in safety. Okay, that is just some of the things that happen on the oaks in your yard every year. So I'm going to end kind of the way we started, talking about the biodiversity crisis we've created on this planet. We've got two crises. We've got climate change, we all know about that, and we've got biodiversity crisis. But if we had no climate change, we would still have a biodiversity crisis because we are not sharing our human-dominated spaces. It is a global crisis because they are the insects, the little things that run the world. Can't live without them. But it has a grassroots solution. There are 4 things that every single landscape needs to do today, every landscape, if we're going to reach a sustainable relationship with the Mother Nature that supports us. They've got to capture carbon for obvious reasons. They've got to manage the watershed that landscape is in. It's got to support a diverse community of pollinators, and it's got to support a complex food web. When you plant an oak, you're addressing each one of those really critical ecological goals. You are planting a plant that's going to capture more carbon over its lifespan than other plants. You're managing the watershed better with those giant root systems. You're supporting a more complex food web than any other plant. You're even helping pollinators, even though oaks are wind pollinated. If you look carefully at your catkins in the spring when they're releasing pollen, a lot of native bees go there. They will gather that pollen up. Now, they're not moving it to the female flowers, so they are not pollinating, but they are benefiting from the pollen of oak trees. Well, despite all those really wonderful landscape attributes, our oaks are in trouble. Most of the giants are gone from our woods for 2 reasons. We got rid of them when we cleared the woods for agriculture, or because they supplied an awful lot of wood. The percentage of oaks in our eastern forests has been cut in half in the last century because we've suppressed fire, which it favors oak germination. And we've also high graded our forests when we harvest them. We take the oaks and leave everything else. We've introduced a lot of serious oak pests, a number of diseases, sudden oak death syndrome, bacterial leaf scorch, oak wilt, a number of pests, the gypsy moth, which is now the spongy moth, because the egg mass looks like a sponge. Winter moth, a bunch of other serious problems for oaks, and deer overabundance. Every single baby oak that comes up is eaten by a deer these days, so we have no recruitment into our forests. We also have habitat fragmentation, which is separating our oaks to the point where the pollen can't reach another oak, and that's what you need for successful acorn production. So for all those reasons, 28 of our 91 North American oak species are now threatened. 1/3 of the global oaks are endangered. The Oregon white oak has lost 97% of its range. Used to grow from almost Southern California all the way up through Washington State because it favors the places that are perfect for agriculture. 2,300 species rely on oaks in Great Britain, and they are now threatened because of the loss of oaks in Great Britain. So we humans live our lives out in a very brief instant of ecological time, and we cannot return the giant oaks to our forests in that time period. But we can start the process. And in no time at all, the oaks that we plant today, tomorrow, next week, will be large enough to assume just about all of their keystone ecological roles in our yards and our landscapes. Now, we are all responsible for good earth stewardship because we all require it. It's not just a few ecologists, a few conservation biologists. We all require healthy ecosystems, so we all have the responsibility of taking care of them. And the best way to exercise your responsibility to good earth stewardship is to embrace the power of oaks. So for the sake of our turkeys, our chickadees, our woodpeckers, our warblers, our jays, our thrushes, our lightning bugs, our gullers, our beetles, our orthopterans, our lepidopterans, our caterpillars, for our own sake. Plant an oak, plant a living community, plant the future. Thanks very much, but I'm not through. I have to talk about Homegrown National Park very, very briefly. This is a small nonprofit that we have started, and the goal is to get the message, that message that we are all responsible for good earth stewardship, to the millions and millions and millions of people who don't know that. They don't recognize, they don't know that their actions on their property is going to make the difference in biodiversity in the future. So we've created this nonprofit, Homegrown National Park. The object is to get yourself registered on the map. Your little piece of your county and the amount of area that you have pledged to be a good steward of, or you already are being a good steward of, is going to light up, and we want to see the whole map light up. We are asking people to reduce the area of lawn. That's the lowest hanging fruit, because lawn's not delivering any of the things we just talked about. Put in more natives than we typically have. Remove invasives that are probably on our property. Almost everybody has invasive plants on their property. Protect any natural areas that may exist there already. Our product is national awareness, not just of what the problem is, but what the solution is. The solution is a grassroots solution. It's get everybody involved. We want to change the culture. We want to recognize that nature is not optional, it's essential, and everybody has responsibility to sustaining it. And that map is also going to provide measurable progress towards the UN's global initiative to save 30% of the earth by 2030 and 50% by 2050. That's not going to happen unless we look at conservation on private property. And the map is a way to do that. The benefits of Homegrown National Park is to convert hope into action. You know, we're tired of hoping and having nothing happen. We want to get our hands dirty and actually do something. It doesn't rely on governmental support, although we would love governmental support. And there's a lot of existing conservation efforts out there already. We've got Audubon, we've got National Wildlife Federation, Y1s, all kinds of national conservation efforts. We want to unite them in one aspirational visual so we can see that we actually are doing better in conservation than we thought when all of everybody's private property lights up. And by the way, it's free, which means we're not pulling anybody away from these other organizations because those are paid organizations. So everybody can be a member of National Wildlife Federation and Homegrown National Park. And that's what's going to create that one visual. And once it's there, we'll get to see where we've got holes in our biological corridors in between viable habitats, so we can know where to focus our educational activities. Okay, now I'm done. Thank you.